Today we're going to be making a clay animal, and you should have researched an endangered species of animals and done some thinking about what adaptations that animal might need in order to survive. Um, I am making a lynx here, and we're going to start by making the armature. So this is what's going to support our sculpture. And because air dry clay, or really any clay, needs to be pretty even with the thickness that we're using, I'm using aluminum foil here for the body because that would be very thick and would not dry nearly as quickly as the rest of the animal. So the second thing that we are going to do is roll out the clay once we have our armature the basic shape that it needs to be. So I'm just rolling this piece of clay out flat. And our air dry clay is very similar to regular kiln fire clay in the way that it feels and works. So your fingers are going to be your best tools here after you've rolled out a fairly thin, but not too thin, I like to say cookie thickness, piece of clay. We're going to wrap that around the armature. Now you may not have used aluminum foil, you may have used something else, cardboard, or maybe you didn't need one for the animal that you were making because it wasn't quite as thick. But you want to get it basically the basic shape, but not perfect, that you want. And I'm just smoothing it out using my fingers and also a plastic tool there. You saw me earlier mix up some slip, which is just water with clay. That is what we need for this step, where we're going to start adding the appendages or little attachments to our animal. So for my lynx that I'm making here, I need 4 legs, a tail, and 2 ears. So I'm going to start with the legs so that it can stand up. So I'm going to take a small ball of clay and divide that into 4 equal parts because I want all of my legs to be about the same size, like they would be on a real lynx or most cats. When you are attaching pieces, if you just stick the clay to the other piece of clay, it's not really going to work. So you have to use slip, so that clay and water mixture, almost as if it's glue. And before you do anything, you need to score your clay. So you'll see me there using a skewer. You could also use a toothpick, a toothbrush, or anything that you could scratch into the clay with. You just need to make some marks on both pieces. So I'm doing that on the top of the leg as well as on the body of the lynx, and then adding some slip to both pieces and then sticking it together and smoothing it out using my fingers and my little plastic tool here. So you're seeing me score and smooth out everything and get it into the basic shape. It doesn't have to be perfect yet. And by no means am I a sculptor. It is not my forte. So I'm sure that some of you all will be able to do a better job than I am. Here I'm using a wooden dowel to kind of help smooth out the clay where I'm adding the legs and also to help shape it. Sometimes it's easier to use something that's rounded than trying to use your fingers, especially if you're doing something smaller. Like right in there, I really couldn't get between the legs very well, so I'm just rolling that clay out with the dowel and also that plastic tool. If your clay starts to crack as you are going and dry out, just get a little bit of water like I just did on my finger and add that to your clay and then roll it around and smooth out any cracks. It will be just fine. You do not want to soak your clay in water though. If your clay gets too wet, it's going to be very, very hard to work with. So just enough water to smooth out the cracks and get it moistened back up. Here I'm working on the back legs. These were a little bit harder because my reference image that I used, the lynx was they kind of stayed low to the ground. So he was squatted a little bit. So the back legs are bent. And so I'm working with trying to keep that bend in the back leg and also keep the rounded shape of the leg. So that took a little bit more time than the front legs did. I also needed to make sure that my legs were thick enough and sturdy enough that it was going to be able to hold up my body. So make sure that as you're working that you find a way to support your animal's body, especially if it's something like mine that has 4 legs. You don't want to do anything that's really, really skinny and is either going to break or just won't support the body and will fall over. So I'm working on those back legs. Kind of go off screen here. Sorry about that, guys. But yeah, make sure that as you're going, you're testing it and making sure that it can stand up. Even though it's not dry yet, it should be able to stand up. If it's going to stand up, it'll be able to do it while it's still wet. I'm making this last leg here, and it's also going to need to be bent. And I have to say, this lynx looks a lot like my cat, Spike, and he's very low to the ground and also has a little bobtail. So I kind of started looking at him and looking at his legs and the way that he walked around, as opposed to looking at my reference image, because I couldn't really see what was going on with the back leg in it. And I'm going off screen again here. Sorry, guys. But just make sure that as you're attaching things, that's where you're most likely to have breaking occur once it's dry. So you really want to make sure that it is well attached, that you are scoring both sides of your attachment, and also adding a decent amount of slip to it, and then smoothing it out completely to where you can't even tell that it was added to your piece. If you see any spots where it looks like you stuck the attachment to your animal, it's very likely that they're going to fall off. So here I'm adding the tufts of hair that lynxes have, and bobcats also have these. Lynxes have a little bit longer ones. I kind of over exaggerated mine, made them pretty long. Kind of looks like he's got some mutton chops. And this one that's closest to his body, I actually went ahead to make sure that it didn't fall off. I just fully attached it to the body, whereas the other side, I let it hang off, so I had to make sure that it was a little bit thicker so that it wasn't going to break and be really fragile. So again, be mindful of your attachments and how thin they are. You don't want to add anything that's super thin because it will likely break off. Also, make sure that you use some sort of tool, a toothpick or something that you can use to carve your initials into the bottom of your animal somewhere so that we don't lose it. Make sure that once you're done adding everything to your animal and you have it in the basic shape that you want it to be, you're going to need to smooth it out. So using your fingers with some water or a wet sponge works best for this. I did not have a sponge, so I'm using mostly my fingers and the skewer. Then you need to add texture. Adding texture, depending on what type of animal you're doing, can be done lots of different ways. You can find a texture that looks similar to your animals and press it into the clay. You could take a skewer or a comb tool and put some little fur marks, which is what I do on mine, just some little lines going in the direction that the fur would be laying on your animal. Just make sure that you don't create any rough, pointy parts that are going to break off. Once you have finished your texture, it's time to paint. Now, when you're painting your animal, I start by painting the whole thing the basic colors that it's going to be. So if your animal's mostly one color, go ahead and paint the whole thing that color. If your animal has very defined spots or stripes, or different parts of its bodies are different colors, put those colors down, but don't worry about all the little color changes. Lynxes have lots of stripes and spots on them, but they're not super well defined. So once I have the gray paint on here, I go in with a darker gray, and then I kind of just blend that into the lighter gray. So I'm just kind of dabbing paint all around and creating that spotted texture. I I don't want to add any tiny details yet. I want to get the basic overall color done before I go in and do eyes and mouth and all of those things that if I have to go back and add colors around it, I might mess up my eyes that I really liked. And if I really like them, then I'm going to be really sad that I messed them up and get frustrated. And I don't want anyone to get frustrated. So go in and get all of the major areas of color down before you start adding your tiny details. Make sure that if you're sharing paint with somebody that you are rinsing your brush off well and drying it off before you start grabbing more color and mixing colors up. If you are mixing your colors without rinsing your brush off, you know that that's going to upset somebody when you've turned the white paint into some muddy brown-green color and they have no more clean white paint and have to go get it. So here I'm working on the details. I've got a much smaller brush. So again, if you've got small details, change your brush size. Use something that's appropriate for your area that you're painting. And if you mess up on something, do not get frustrated. It is just paint. It's very easy to paint over once it's dry. I believe I skipped through most of me doing the face here, but because I'm not a great sculptor, I didn't do a whole lot to the face with the clay. So I'm really relying on my painting skills here to define the mouth and eye and nose area. So I take quite a bit of time on this because, like I said, I only made kind of a nose shape and a little bit of a brow shape, and that was about it when I was sculpting it. But once you are done, make sure that you can still see your initials on the bottom of your animal. When you're done, you will make sure that you put it on a paper plate to dry. And then once it's dry, we are going to spray it with some glossy varnish just to make it look more like a ceramic piece of work rather than air dry clay. And you guys can take your animal home.